We're ready to start our Chapter 8, Lecture number 3. We'll talk about some demographic analysis, urbanization, trade, and development in this lecture. We'll begin by talking about the cultural demographic analysis of kind of a generic overview of the majority of the population of Africa south of the Sahara. We have the highest fertility rate and mortality rates in the world together, showing a relatively high level of low development, if we can say that. An area showing not strong development, and those characteristics can be observed in some of the demographic factors. Culture is a driving factor, in fact, in aspects of high fertility and mortality rates. The traditional societies promote younger marriage, and there are higher rates of polygamy and remarriage, reduce the typical social issues related to divorce. Other impacts culturally include the belief systems, customs, and traditions of the various ethnic groups. One of the most important is the fact that high fertility rates are a treasured aspects of the culture. The ability to have lots of children means that you have the ability to generate lots of income for your extended family as you have more people to do work. In order to support the populations, as we had mentioned before, the children are often fostered by other members of the family, especially some of the older members of the family who may not be able to do as much physical labor as some of the younger adults are able to do. Yet the younger adults are the ones who are reproducing and creating more children, but they're the ones who have to do the work. The region has the highest proportion of young dependents. As we look at a population pyramid later in this lecture, we'll discuss this further. The patriarchal societies also, as a cultural analysis, are a cause of high fertility rates. In particular, we move on then to the village life and traditional agriculture. The majority of the people reside in rural areas. Somewhere between 60 and 70% of the population of Africa south of the Sahara live in rural areas. The smallest unit of residence is a village compound or homestead. Often this is a few families related by marriages, and their extended families of young to the older population. Rural residents rely almost exclusively on agriculture for livelihood and sustenance. There are two primary types of agriculture occurring in the smaller traditional village farms. These include shifting agriculture, where the farmers move every few years in search of new land after the soil in the existing plots has become exhausted of all the mineral content. There's also a more sedentary rotational bush fallow system, where the cultivated areas rotate around a fixed location, that, of course, being the position of the village. There is also pastoralism, commonly practiced in the grasslands and semi-arid regions of Africa, such as West Africa Sahel, that transition zone between the more tropical West Africa and the southern part of the Sahara, as well as parts of Kenya and Botswana, also semi-arid grasslands. Here we see that population age distribution pyramid. These are classic measures of analysis, helping people understand the population breakdown by age and by numbers of population. First thing we notice when we look at these charts is that the United States is only looking at a range of less than 30 million people, while the range of population and numbers of population are looked at approaching 200 million in the African chart. When we look at the age distribution, though, that's kind of what significantly we want to look at. We see a very wide young population, showing that the youth are a greater percentage of the total population than what we see in a developed country such as the United States, where you see very uniform age groups, slightly more children, but only slightly, otherwise relatively even distribution of masculine and feminine populations, and number of people until about age 55, whereas then populations start to decline in the age ranges. In the less developed pyramid, classic here in the African example, we see a true population pyramid. The younger the population, generally, the wider the range, and the larger the numbers of that population age range. The numbers of these are for many, many reasons, including lower health care, dangerous occupational hazards, and earlier or shorter lifespans reported. If you take a look at the CIA World Factbook website that I probably have talked about before, and you select one of the countries and look under the population and demographics section, the CIA actually generates these types of population age distribution charts for all the countries that they follow on that website. It's very interesting to take a look at the variety of population pyramids that can occur depending upon the social and economic conditions of any particular country. Urbanization. There is a rural to urban migration, very common and increasing in this region. 346 million, or 38% or so of the population, live in urban areas now. That does make it, however, one of the least urbanized areas in the world. It has the highest urbanization growth rate in the world, though. And we find that the African cities exert a strong force of primacy in each of the regions where they exist. The cities are in their general locations primarily due to economic reasons. Transportation is one of the strongest reasons for them to be there. Also, the resource extractions. And so these cities have a strong draw for a number of reasons. And why do people move to the urban areas? There is the draw of potential economic opportunity that can be very real in some areas in Africa. People move to urban areas because the government tends to neglect the rural areas by lack of investment in infrastructure, lack of investment in education. There are droughts, and people have to leave because of lack of food and lack of livelihood. Sometimes there is the desire to escape the social constraints of the extended family that can feel overbearing to some individuals. Sometimes there's the need to generate cash for bride wealth, and so some of the male members may go to the cities in order to generate cash and then move back in order to provide the bride wealth and be able to marry. There is also the issue of birth order and inheritance laws in many countries where only the oldest child can inherit things like the land that the family farms, thereby necessitating that the younger family members move to the urban areas in order to find another type of livelihood. The effects of urbanization include inadequate water supply and sewage disposal. Often these cities are not planned and grow relatively in an uncontrolled fashion, unrestricted fashion. We also see that there are not sufficient jobs available in many cases. There is ineffective public transportation in most of these urban areas, once again tied to a general weak basic infrastructure throughout all aspects of the urban complex. Often These values are measured by the City Prosperity Index that is discussed on page 369 of your text. And this City Prosperity Index measures economic growth and job generation, infrastructure development, and quality of life reflected in things like public spaces, community cohesion, civic identity, equality, gender equality, civil rights, and environmental sustainability, to name a few. Another effect of urbanization is the expansion in these urban areas of the informal sector of labor. The informal sector generally mean jobs where the income is not monitored by the government and is untaxed, meaning a loss of revenue for the overall community through their government. Also on page 369, we see a developmental pattern of Accra, Guyana, sectorial pattern, kind of very theoretical display of uncontrolled urban and suburban sprawl, typical of places in West Africa. Here we see a kind of in the center point, a historic district, and forming around that historic Old Town district, we see the development of military regions, areas of light industry, upper income housing, commercial districts in some of these upper income areas, some industry. We have moving away from the city to the more outer reaches, the lower income residential areas, often containing large ethnic enclaves of local population. We have regions of middle income, and as we move into the most outer reaches of the urbanized area, we see a sprawled combination of urban agriculture, truck farming type activities, and even larger farms, intermixed with development of higher income families who may have purchased this land, and in addition to generating income in other fashions in the urban environment, also are farming their larger parcels of land. Energy sources are discussed as well in the book here on page 349. When we look at the energy sources and we consider the population being 60 to 70% rural, we see that the use of biomass fuels is well over 50% of the total use of energy generation. Those fuels include the burning of things like wood, agricultural byproducts, stalks from the previous year's growth. Also, as we discussed in the Montserrat lecture when we talked about the Caribbean region, charcoal is a very important form of fuel, especially in the tropical regions. Charcoal has to be created because the partial burning of the biomass of the wood in this case drives out insects and moisture and allows that wood to be preserved for longer periods of time to be used for cooking. Oil, which is available in some parts of the country in larger amounts, some parts of the region in larger amounts, is a very important fuel source as well at 25%. Electricity in some places, especially those where the hydroelectric power has been put into place on some of the steeper rapids and wider rivers, is about 1/10 of the energy source. Coal is only about 4%, and natural gas as well is low at only about 5%. Biomass is the largest energy source, and we find this relatively unique due to the tropical environment of Central Africa and the large rural population together form this high biomass energy use. Let's take a look at trading partners here. I think the thing that really jumps out for me on this is the continuing aspect of neocolonialism. If I look at any of these countries and see who their primary trade partners are, they are related to their original colonizing European forces, with the exception of those countries that have a petroleum aspect to their economy. Those countries that have a petroleum aspect to their economy have moved beyond other regions to those countries that have a high demand for petroleum, such as the United States and China. So we see Sudan has a petroleum trade with China, Japan. We see that Nigeria has a petroleum trade with the United States. Economic dimensions of development. Generally speaking, the economic development of the Africa south of the Sahara has a very poor performance. There are structural problems in key productive sectors, lower levels of investment, and poor or unimproved infrastructure. These, of course, help contribute to the poor export performance, and there are declining terms of trade with places outside of Africa. The neo-colonial relationship often dictates the prices, and those prices tend to drop and drop and drop in a neo-colonial economic system. There are countries that have severe debt burdens as they try to develop resources or resource extraction. There is inefficient resource use, wasted water, wasted human resources as well. People are not used efficiently in industrial settings or agricultural settings for that matter. There are low levels of technological capabilities, also resulting in lower production rates. Many countries have high protectionist policies to protect their import substitution industrialization, or industries that are produced using local materials and done within the country where the materials are produced to reduce import costs. In addition, there is a lot of illegal resource extraction going on, illegal timbering, illegal mining, all of which removes wealth from the country and from the government in order to perhaps provide the ability for greater infrastructure investment, which can't occur in the case of illegal activities. There's an impact of diseases historically in Africa. The HIV/AIDS impact on development has been severe in the past. There has been some data suggesting that the levels of HIV/AIDS are dropping currently for a number of reasons, primarily new research and development in assisting people who have acquired AIDS. But how does this disease affect development in Africa? One of the most noticeable demographic aspects is the reduced life expectancy. Generally, in the regions that have the highest levels of AIDS, we find in analysis of the data that life expectancy has been reduced by as much as 10 years. And of course, that makes Africa appear to be even more of become higher undeveloped, less levels of development occurring there due to the shorter life expectations. There is some data that suggests there is a racial or gender variations in the AIDS infection. But there are questions as to how reliable reports are that are used to analyze the data. It's very difficult to go into many of these places and really determine the extent of AIDS and the demographic of people who have AIDS, in fact. So it's interesting to consider, for example, the economic impact of the 2014 outbreak of Ebola. and how that affected economic activity for West Africa, where it was the strongest. There's plenty of places on the web that have discussed that in recent times as people continue to try and understand as Ebola epidemic has dramatically been reduced or has been controlled, how that has affected economies of the countries where the epidemic was the strongest. There are uneven patterns of development. We recognize two dualistic patterns. There are extreme gaps between less developed parts of Africa and more industrialized parts of Africa. The disparity between some of the rural, remote agricultural regions in landlocked countries, especially those in the Sahel, just south of the south part of the Sahara, that very poor part of Africa. And in fact, there are times when drought comes through and people become desperate, and there have been many cases in the last few decades where a drought has resulted in many deaths and extreme poverty in that region. There also exists a core peripheral disparity between the modern centers of industry and trade, the primate cities of each region, and the traditional rural peripheries that supply goods and materials, raw goods and raw materials for the industrial regions. We see that the urban areas have much higher investment, stronger infrastructure, more affluent population, and as you move away from those cities, you have less government investment, lower education, lower income, less health care. And all these contribute to those uneven patterns of development. So how can we improve development in our region? Interdependent development is one way that has been developed over the past few decades. Developing cooperative and compatible arrangement to facilitate development. There should be cooperation between national and local governments, local and international organizations, or non-governmental organization, NGOs. Its contribution to try to develop relationships that benefit everyone. There are also the national and international governments and organizations can contribute to development strategies by making the proper investments. We see regional cooperation and interdependence growing, as we've seen, for example, in South America, how important that was in terms of building their economic activities. There have been movements in parts of Africa, and successful movements, in fact, in some of these blocks, such as the Organization of African Unity. In 1963, it was formed, the African Economic Community, and there are also memberships in other regional blocks for Southern Africa, West Africa, East Africa. Finally, for Lecture 3, let's take a look at the manufacturing and mineral resources. This map is on page 375 of your text. Probably some of the most significant things to jump out would be the Ring of Diamonds, a mineral-rich region around some of the rift zones and desert regions of southern Africa, creating diamonds, gold, magnesium, ferro metals such as iron and copper, just to name a few. But the diamonds often are considered very significant through this region. Gold also in other parts of the rift zone in the south. Coal is in the rift zones as well. Uranium here on the West African coast or near the coast is important. Also, there are some diamonds and bauxite in this region as well. Gold, iron, and other metals. Off in the interior, we don't see much here. A little bit of uranium, but the exploration and extraction of minerals in these regions because of the landlocked location and difficulties in transportation, while there may be mineral potentials here, they have not been developed due to the friction of distance or the problems of transporting them. We see mineral-rich area here also around the rift zone of East Africa. We see industrial regions building around that rift zone. Some of these resource areas around the oil-producing coast of Nigeria and the port cities as well have core manufacturing and agricultural processing centers from the interior. These are the primate cities on the coast that support the activities of resource extraction and farming on the interiors. We have a core manufacturing and agricultural region in South Africa, very important and strong agriculture in this region. Well, that's it for our Chapter 8, Lecture 3, and we'll talk to you again for our next lecture.